from lunch, it is time to hear from our fifth presenter, Hannah Slopak.
This is so scary. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hannah Slopak, and today I'll be talking about more than words, the destructive impact of emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is a silent yet devastating force. It is a quiet attack that reshapes the victim's view of themselves in ways that are both subtle and deep. Unlike physical abuse that heals with time or treatment, the psychological trauma from emotional abuse can take years, sometimes a lifetime, to unravel. Yet its impact is just as destructive, if not more so. It is a silent assault that often goes unnoticed, dismissed, or misunderstood. The repeated insults, manipulation, gaslighting, and neglect that characterize this form of abuse chip away at a person's sense of self-worth and crushes their spirit, leaving them questioning their value and perceptions of reality. Over time, these images distort how they see themselves, replacing self-confidence with shame, self-doubt, and fear. They may even begin to internalize the abuser's critical messages, believing they are undeserving of love, respect, or happiness. This twisted sense of self leads to a crippling spiral of mental disorders. What makes emotional abuse so insidious is that it takes place over time, so gradually that the victim may not even realize their brain chemistry and self-image has been altered. Once the damage is done, the victim will no longer be the same again, partially because their brain will suffer physical changes and because intense emotional damage changes a person's personality. Having been exposed to a sort of innocence stripped from them and pieces of them shattered like glass, some pieces remaining unrecognizable and some able to be fixed. Imagine it in a literal situation. A severe storm had been brewing outside the girls' living room for hours. The force of the wind rocked the trees side to side, almost to the point of snapping under the pressure. The rain clouded the view looking out the window, and the thunder shook the house, making picture frames, flower vases, and a grand mirror rattle. As the storm continued, the thunder got stronger and intensified every time it sounded. The mirror shook violently against the wall until it unhooked itself from its hinges and fell to the concrete. Upon impact, the stunning glass shattered into large chunks across the floor, and the wooden frame lay in the middle of the mess. She sat frozen on the couch, partially because the storm frightened her, and in disbelief of the once solid, flawless, and bright masterpiece that lay broken in front of her. The mirror had been a constant in the room, reflecting everything in it and illuminating the sunlight. But now, its reflection and illumination is gone. The room, the world, everything felt out of sync. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was recognition. The mirror had always been a symbol of stability, a way of seeing herself and the world clearly. But now, as she stood in the dim light of the storm's fury, she always believed that things could be fixed, that everything could return to its original state if given enough time and enough effort. But now, as she stood in the dim light of the storm's fury, the broken glass before her told a different story. One of the things that can never be the same once pieced back together again, no matter how badly she wanted it to be. And she tried. She put every single glass back into place like a puzzle. Even though some pieces were unrecoverable, which made the mirror have wider cracks than others, she hung it back on its hooks and looked at her distorted image. The mirror looked at her distorted image. One of the things that can never be the same. Nope. Ooh. Sorry, guys. Sorry. My bad. A little nervous. Some breaks leave marks that can never fully heal. Throughout the rest of this presentation, two important terms will be used frequently: emotional abuse and physical abuse. Emotional abuse is a non-physical abuse that is meant to control, isolate, or frighten the victim. Physical abuse is the intentional bodily injuries. Well-known author, doctor, and therapist Gregory Jantz highlights the destruction of emotional abuse and the dangers it inflicts on its victims. He goes on to say that emotional abuse, while invisible, has a very destructive impact. It is more destructive than physical and emotional abuse because it is easy to deny and hard to prove. In his book, Healing the Scars of Emotional Abuse, he describes what it is like to be in a relationship with someone who personifies Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Millie is a young, beautiful woman, married to James, her equally handsome husband. At first glance to the people at the country club, they seem like the perfect match made in heaven. James is always bragging about her elegance and covering her in the finest jewels. He presents her as his trophy wife. She is constantly being admired for her sleek, shiny blonde hair and petite body that is clothed in the newest fashion. All the women want to be her. They bicker amongst each other about why their husbands cannot show them off like James shows off Millie. However, Millie's home life is not quite the same as her country club lunches. She is not safe to let her guard down or even have a strand of hair out of place. In the privacy of their home, she is bombarded with insults about her abilities, weight, appearance, and laziness, even though she hardly eats because her stomach is constantly in knots, and she has been crying all day, dreading the moment he walks through the door and starts to belittle her for never doing anything right, wearing the wrong outfit to the club, and talking to the wrong people. In public, James loves her. He is proud of her. She makes him look good, hence her trophy wife label. But behind closed doors, he is a completely different person. He is humiliated of her, destroying her self-esteem and making her feel absolutely worthless. James is just one minor example of one type of emotional abuser. Abuse comes in many different forms, with physical, sexual, and emotional being the main types and most common. Society sees abuse as a noticeable physical harm inflicted upon the victim. Visible signs are present, normally from beatings, fights, or forced sexual acts that lead to bruising or open wounds. Another visible sign may be the use of makeup to cover the marks left by the abuser. Since physical abuse is characterized by more easily identifiable proof to confirm its existence and damage, treatment is often quickly offered and available. However, emotional abuse may not be recovered or treated until months or years later. Emotional abuse is the most damaging form of abuse for many reasons. For starters, it is a silent and invisible battle fought over periods of time with no blood, open wounds, or black eyes to cause alarm to people in their everyday life. There is no scar tissue to stretch, no bruises to yellow and heal, no gaping wound to point to. In spite of their invisibility, emotional wounds comprise a very damaging form of abuse. In 2008, 4 researchers, Chin, Williams, Fitness, and Newton, created an article called When Hurt Will Not Heal and discovered that emotional pain is remembered long after physical pain has faded in memory and would appear to have far-reaching consequences for mental health, relationships, and adaptations to change. For example, if someone breaks their arm, years later they will not be able to reproduce the pain they felt the day the accident happened. They will remember the pain was extreme, but physically cannot feel the pain just by thinking about it. On the other hand, if you are bullied and reminisce on that emotional mistreatment in the future, the pain can or will return to be relived over and over again. Those who have been emotionally mistreated have often said it is worse than physical punishment. Emotional abuse is not just being bullied. In fact, 3 main tactics are employed by the abuser, causing bombardment on the victim's soul. When people hear the term emotional abuse, their first thought is most likely verbal abuse. First, these abusers use their words to manipulate, control, isolate, influence, punish, and trap their victims. Oftentimes, the tone and rashness in their voice strikes fear and submission to the other person. These messages, repeated often and forcefully, infiltrate to the inner being of their victim, shaping the way they view themselves. Those changes in a person's view of themselves is why the effects are so lasting. Second is the abuse through actions. Those who don't think words are enough like to intimidate, control, and impose threats upon the victim. Depending on whether or not the abuser is in a good or bad mood determines the outcome of their punishment. There was no use in talking back or speaking up in your defense. That would only make the attack worse, adding fuel to the fire. It was better to shut up and take it. Last but not least is the abuse through neglect. Neglect is the most damaging form of emotional abuse. It is the absence of the expected when words should be said or actions should be taken, but instead the victim is ignored. What is so damaging is that usually the abuser is from whom the person desperately wants to receive love and attention. The sense of rejection, abandonment, betrayal can cause a lot of devastating effects. The damage left behind by emotional abuse is like no other. The effects are mentally and physically wearing, affecting personality, self-esteem, relationships, and the brain as well as the rest of the body. Since emotional abuse is a systematic attack on one's sense of self, the effects are ones that play with your mind and feelings. Even after the constant brainwashing is over, it doesn't suddenly stop hurting. Mentally, the victim is left dealing with anxiety, depression, fear, hypersensitivity, confusion, disconnection, insecurity, guilt, shame, rage, numbness, and disassociation. Dr. Jantz heavily touches on abuse by stating, "Abuse of any kind, emotional included, is an attack on oneself. It demeans and controls that person, devaluing them and ultimately elevating the abuser. If you are someone who has suffered abuse in your past or is suffering it in your present, it is not something to be denied, ignored, perpetuated, or accepted. The damage it does to the sense of self is pervasive and destructive." Throughout his years, he has found several distinct negative characteristics associated with emotional abuse: low self-esteem, lack of confidence, transfer of needs, acting out sexually, loneliness, failure syndrome, perfectionism, unrealistic guilt, crisis-oriented, unresolved anger, and resentments. Most of these effects are self-explanatory and easily seen in people's lives. But what most people don't realize is that our minds and our bodies are connected. So what we feel emotionally, we experience physically. For example, transfer of needs is seen in addictions of all kinds: drug, alcohol, sexual, and eating. Failure syndrome is jeopardizing your relationships or yourself and not knowing why. But oftentimes it is because the abuser has led them to believe they have no worth and are destined to fail. Unrealistic guilt is because their abuser has accused them of everything and anything that could go wrong, making it seem if they had done something different, then the outcome would be different. Obviously, we know emotional abuse is going to cause emotional and psychological problems. I just said that. But what people don't realize is that it's seen physically too. So the ways it's most physically seen is through addictions, allergies, depression, anxiety, digestive disturbances, eating disorders, hypochondria, panic attacks, phobias, headaches, unexplained skin rashes, and unexplained physical pains. One of the most damaging effects is that it distorts one's vision and the way they perceive things. It causes them to see a false reflection in the mirror and makes their eyes distrust what they see and what their heart feels deep down. Then a pattern is created. Oftentimes, the trauma acts as a magnet, leading them to attach to people replicating their past abuser. Logically, this does not make any sense. However, it is scientific that a girl will marry a man resembling the traits and actions her father has, and a man will marry a girl resembling the traits and actions his mother has. So, if your abuser was a parent of the opposite sex, then it is likely you'll be attracted to a lover with those same traits. If a girl's father was controlling, then it is likely she'll be attracted to a man who is possessive and overbearing. If a man's mother was loud and outspoken, then it is likely a girl with those same characteristics will attract him. While there are many similarities, even though not all negative characteristics are a bad thing, nonetheless a cycle is created. In a stable or unstable household, this cycle occurs subconsciously. It is important to recognize the abusive traits from others so you can know if there is a need to separate them and destroy the pattern before risky relationships are spawned in the future. In every form of abuse, there is a power imbalance. Emotional abuse is accompanied by the abuser holding the power of mind games and the ability to brainwash their victims. Physical abuse is accompanied by the literal overpowering strength of the one inflicting the blows. A real-life example of physical abuse and its effect on a person's life is Alice Liveling's story from her first relationship when she was 16 years old. She suffered both a physical and emotionally abusive relationship. In an interview with Cosmopolitan UK, she tells her story. Alice says she struggled to recognize what had happened to her for what it was: domestic abuse. But more than 8 years later, she finally felt comfortable opening up about it and was able to realize what had happened to her. When she got out of the relationship, it took her a good few years to even realize the amount of trauma it had caused. Part of the issue is there's such a stereotype attached to domestic abuse. She was 16 when it happened. No one thinks it happens at that age, but it does. It started small with her boyfriend, Charles. He was attentive, wanting to know where she was and what she was doing throughout the day. She was flattered when he was jealous of other guys. She thought he really cared about her, until he hit her. Alice said she must have said something really flippant, because he just lifted his arm and slapped her leg really hard. She remembered bursting into tears immediately and saying, "I can't believe you just hit me. What the hell?" Charles' response was a common one among violent partners. He was quick to apologize repeatedly, showering her with gifts, taking her out to dinner, and behaving lovingly towards her. But then he would do it again. Alice became so emotionally manipulated by Charles that she began to believe it was her fault, that she made him so angry that he had to do that. He became controlling over her entire life, cutting her off from her friends, family, and even accusing her of cheating every time she went out. Alice was terrified of him. She was scared to leave, but she was also scared to stay. When she did try to break up with him, he would threaten suicide. One time, he sat on the edge of a railroad bridge saying, "If you break up with me, I'm going to jump." Despite his manipulation, Alice was able to leave him. But then he began harassing her and her family. He would call the house phone at all hours of the night, causing them to unplug the phone. Alice was scared to leave the house, but she was also scared to stay in. One day, Alice had a right to be scared, because no more than a few days later, as she was walking across campus for class, Charles pulled up in his car with a baseball bat. He got out of the car, pushed her up against the wall, and physically assaulted her. The public nature of the assault meant that there had been several witnesses, and the whole thing was caught on camera. The police quickly got involved, and he went to court. where he was accused of ABH and was convicted of it, which is actual bodily harm. He was giving a restraining order and was giving community service. That was the last time Alice ever saw Charles. And while her physical scars quickly healed, the emotional damage lasted a lot longer. In an interview, she said, "The physical abuse is of course awful. I'm in no way saying one's worse than the other. But sometimes I think the emotional abuse is a little bit harder to deal with. Everyone knows punching someone isn't okay. But it's the emotional stuff that's a lot harder to rationalize with not being your fault. When you get out of an abusive relationship, you really have to start from ground zero and build yourself up again." As we see, while actively being physically abused is awful, painful, and terrifying, and even worse than actively being emotionally abused, the effects are ones that last a lot longer. The emotional damage inflicted by constant manipulation, degradation, control are ones that stick around a lot longer. They're even as debilitating as physical violence. In fact, research has shown that that emotional abuse can disrupt brain chemistry, impair cognitive functions, and lead to long-term brain damage. The main and most common regions affected are the amygdala, a small part of the brain which is meant to control your emotions, mainly fear and aggression. The prefrontal cortex, also known as the personality center, is in control of impulse control and decision making. The hippocampus is in control of your memories. Last but not least is the hypothalamus, known to be responsible for stress and regulating your hormones. Also known to be in control of the release of adrenaline and cortisol. It plays a key role in maintaining the body's balance during times of stress. When each of these are subjected to constant maltreatment, chaos is almost inevitable. The amygdala is the main part that controls your fight or flight response. When it becomes over-responsive, it leads to heightened fear, anxiety, and aggression. It also can make the victim hypervigilant, feeling like they're in a sense of danger even in a safe environment, especially if the situation reminds them of a time from their abuse. When these emotions are constantly active, it triggers the body to produce a stimulus designed to make the body either fight or flee. But because neither of these responses is practical for this time, the body has to deal with the chemical aftermath these emotions can produce. If not handled properly, a landslide of physical and emotional issues can occur, such as amygdala and prefrontal cortex imbalance, hippocampus shrinkage, cognitive impairment, and emotional reactivity. A damaged prefrontal cortex can make it hard for an individual to respond to stress without getting overstimulated, struggle with decision making, and even obtain problems with impulse control. The hippocampus is vital for controlling or retaining your information and memories. When it becomes impaired, it becomes hard to remember things from the past. Good and bad memories are either lost or skewed. The hypothalamus is vital for controlling your body's stable state. When it becomes impaired, health problems occur, such as weight loss or gain, muscle loss or weakness, irregular sleep patterns, and body temperature or high or low blood pressure. Disassociation or trauma blocking is another issue of prolonged fight or flight or emotional abuse in general. The brain resorts to disassociation as a survival mechanism, leading to a disconnect from thoughts, feelings, and emotions. It is a way for the brain to protect itself and an attempt to shield the victim from overwhelming emotional and psychological distress. During trauma blocking, the brain essentially walls off or represses memories from the abuse, making them inaccessible to the conscious recall, even though the memory still exists in the brain. In conclusion, while physical abuse is worse in the moment, the bruises and broken bones will heal, even though they may leave behind scars from the pain inflicted, and as a constant reminder, the initial pain will be gone. However, the unseen scars of emotional abuse will last a lifetime if not properly treated. They will continue to affect the victim physically and mentally, even affecting how they handle relationships, change, and the possibility of causing generational trauma. The trauma can cause a variety of mental disorders, personality disorders, and even potential substance abuse. As stated previously, emotional abuse is just as damaging as physical violence. Not only does it destroy one's self-esteem, reality, and identity, it skews with their physical well-being too. Oftentimes, people will experience chronic health problems for which their doctor can find no reason for. The old adage, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," has proven to be false, because research has shown words and adverse behavior have highly damaging physical effects. Thank you.
I was about to die.
Whew. I would now like to open the floor for questions. My hands are sweaty.
So I am super proud of you.
I'm trying.
Okay, so one thing that I found really interesting in your research was the effect that emotional abuse can have on your body without you knowing it. So the parts of the brain, hypothalamus, all of that. So how, and I'm thinking about at the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about the mirror that shattered and could never be put back together like it was. So, but how do you recover from that trauma when it's not able to be seen? What are things that you can do to help heal from that? But also, can the body, did you find that in your research, can the body actually heal itself from that, your brain?
So from what I had found about the brain specifically, so I had mentioned that the brain becomes physically altered, like the hippocampus shrinkage and the cognitive impairment. And after a while, when your body finally cleanses itself from that constant state of fight or flight, it is able to relearn cognitive functions and how to be in a setting without being super hypervigilant all the time. As far as the physical changes go, from my research and what I haven't really found is that I have not yet found whether an answer for that. I'm not sure if your brain can ever go back to its physical state, but my research didn't get as far as that. But from what I did look, I wasn't able to find anything. Hi, Mr. Jotty.
First of all, I'm impressed that you can say the phrase amygdala and prefrontal cortex in balance without stumbling.
Yay!
I often find, like, if I'm having discussions in class, if a student says something, a lot of times I'll look at them and say more about that. And so I guess that's the kind of question I want to ask you is maybe in a different way or just more. Tell me what you're trying to persuade me of.
I'm trying to persuade you of. Okay. So what I'm trying to persuade you of, and like I have stated before, physical abuse, in my opinion, is worse than emotional abuse. Actively being physically abused is worse than emotionally abused. But in my research from multiple scientists and writers, I have conducted the conclusion that the long-term effects of emotional abuse will stick around and affect the victim longer than those of physical abuse.
No, that's good. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I'm yeah.
So I guess
Go ahead.
The follow-up question then would be, what do you want this audience to do as a result of that?
Is that basically the question why I chose this topic?
Kind of. I mean, it kind of is that, but it's like, what are the practical applications of what you
Practical
just said?
applications.
Like, what do you want us to do as your listeners
Right.
as a result of that?
Right. Well, honestly, in writing this, I wanted to be able to spread awareness to domestic abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, basically just abuse in general. So like if you have family members or friends that you know are actively suffering from abuse or have suffered from abuse, maybe some things you can take away from my paper or like even hint in your brain that you can do further research on, you are able to help them recover or get out of that abusive situation. So that's the whole point. Yes.
And, it does seem like physical abuse and emotional abuse probably go. If you're being physically abused, you're probably being emotionally abused.
Of course, 100%.
I guess part of the thing I want to ask about is almost a throwback to Lauren's talk today. So frequently, the church feels like it's being persecuted when it's like being exposed to stuff it would prefer not to be exposed to. And what I find is a lot of people claim emotional abuse when it's just that someone was being slightly mean to them.
Right.
How do you distinguish between garden variety meanness that everybody does in a family scenario at times from emotional abuse?
So my paper has been taken from like a relationship standpoint. So a parallel to that would be like red flags in a relationship. That could be from the boyfriend or the girlfriend. And those are typically seen early on in the relationship, and it's something you can either choose to ignore work through, or it can end the relationship right then and there. From an emotional abuse standpoint, though, you are, like, the whole point of my thing is saying that it is invisible and hidden. So early on in a relationship, you're not going to see those effects, but as it progresses and as it gets more damaging to the victim, you'll start to see it in their eating habits, the way they act, their character. They might withdraw from you as a friend. They might eat less. They might be losing weight. Things can just be really off with them. And like sometimes you'll see that within like the first month, but sometimes it could be as long as 5 months before those signs are visible to the public eye. So that's how I would distinguish the two.
I guess the other thing, somewhat connected to my previous question, is like there's a victimization kind of reality that frequently, especially as we're young, we feel like victims. All of us feel like victims.
Mm-hmm.
When maybe or we may or may not be, your dad's a police officer, and so like police officers regularly get called out, and sometimes it's a lot worse than they anticipated, but sometimes it's like, okay, you're claiming abuse when it's probably not.
You're being dramatic, right?
Yeah. And frequently, I guess as a pastor, I've seen a lot of, especially wives, abandon their husbands because they say I'm being emotionally abused. Sometimes I look at it and say, man,
You're just being a little,
abuse.
yeah.
Sometimes I'm like,
You're just being a little
this is
sensitive.
normal relational stuff that you're working through. Like, how do you think you would counsel, let's say, a couple going through, a wife going through struggles, or a girlfriend going through struggles, next 4 years, when you're not sure how severe it is, if that makes sense?
If it's not like,
You don't know if it's really abuse or if it's just
or
normal
just,
conflict.
okay. It would probably start from like I would probably ask their whole entire history from both his childhood and her childhood up until where they are now, and then into the relationship they are in together, and see where their relationship started, how it started, the issues they have had like together as well as separately, and seeing if that is just like a miscommunication from one person to the other, or if it is something deeper with like each of their personalities, and just kind of building from there, and then like feeling out the entire situation. That's probably how I'd start.
So one thing you mentioned was, one of the stories was James, and that he loved her in public but not in private. How would you encourage even the students in this room who are now going into finding someone to have a relationship with? What are signs that they could look for in saying, hey, that's not acceptable for me, and for them to know that, yes, this is love versus, no, this is not love?
I know this question. So if we're taking it from a biblical aspect, God tells us what love is. It's patient, it's kind, it's not arrogant, it doesn't boast, it's not rude. Love is like a very fruitful thing. It's good. It should be healing. It should be very much like a mood booster. So in your relationship, if you are feeling very down, unsure of your relationship, you might feel like he or her does not have the qualities of a good boyfriend or husband or wife or whatever, then that's something you definitely need to look at, being like, hey, is that just like he's having a bad day, or is she having a bad day and they're kind of off with me, or is it something that's going to progress? Like, especially if you're in a friend group setting, he might be, or he or she might be super like bragging about you, like, this is my girlfriend, isn't she great, she's the sweetest thing ever, giving you flowers in public, the little things. But behind closed doors, if you are one-on-one on a date or something and he's very rude, dismissive, whatever, that's definitely an indicator of, hey, there might be a little something more up. If that answers the question.
So Hannah, you made that statement about he or she, and I think normally we attribute physical abusers to be men. But did your research direct you to emotional abuse can be a female to a male also?
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yes. So now that you said that, I think I skipped that in my presentation because that was more at the beginning. I was really, really nervous. So yes, actually I do. There's 2 sentences in my presentation where I say actively, or still messing up. Wow. Okay. Emotional abuse is usually dealt out by both the man and the woman, but physical abuse more times than not is the male. So yes, I did see that in my research.
Hannah, I'm gonna tell you something that you have in your paper that I think will help kind of wrap up what you are trying to say is the difference between, how do you even know if it is emotional abuse? And you really, in your paper, do a very good job of outlining what that is.
Are you talking about my 3
Labeled it
things?
really well. Well, here's how you've labeled it. Repeated insults,
Mm-hmm.
manipulation, gaslighting, emotional neglect, humiliation, rejection, betrayal, and powerlessness.
Mm-hmm.
So in your research, you did do a very good job of defining what emotional abuse is. So in your efforts to make everyone aware of how to determine if somebody is maybe just being mean or being emotionally abusive, you do have your points laid out very well to help anybody who wanted to know if this is really what they were experiencing. You really have done a very good job of
Thank
detailing
you.
it out, and you've worked for a long time
I
to
have.
make sure that this all came together. So
Thank you.
very good job, Hannah. You are at your time.
Yay!
You are-
Thank you.